Well, hello everyone. I'm delighted to open up our Meet the Author program today and welcome our speaker, Lyn Julius, who is joining the Fifth Avenue Synagogue community from London. Ms. Julius will be speaking about her book, Uprooted, How 3,000 Years of Jewish Civilization in the Arab World Vanished Overnight. It promises to be a fascinating discussion, particularly in light of recent historic political developments that have advanced a reopening of parts of the Arab world to Israel and thus to the Jewish people. I know we're all looking forward to hearing her insights into the dynamics surrounding the circumstances that caused flourishing and successful communities to dwindle and in some cases disappear altogether. I want to express my thanks to Carol and Michael Goddard, who initiated the program today and who connected us to Ms. Julius. Beyond the program today, I thank them as well for their ongoing efforts to support the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Kahila in their leadership roles in the men's and women's clubs and through their regular involvement in shul prayer and learning. Carol will be introducing Lyn Julius today. After Ms. Julius speaks, she's graciously agreed to take questions. So please feel free to submit your questions through the chat or Q&A functions on the screen. And with that, I'll turn things over to Carol.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. So I'm very pleased and delighted to welcome Lyn as our guest speaker today. Not only is she my sister-in-law, but she is also a successful journalist and author. As most of you know, Lyn lives in London. Although she and her brothers were born in London, her parents and family fled from Iraq in the 50s to escape persecution. The plight of her family and those of other Jews in Arab lands is a story that has largely been untold. Lyn has made it her mission to make sure their story was heard and not forgotten. This is her book and the meticulous detail that it contains. Not only do I want to thank you for being an amazing mother, wife, and integral member of our family, but also for being so dogged, determined, and focused in assembling the material that gives voice to our brethren who suffered at the hands of the Arabs. Without further ado, I want to hand this over to Lyn. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Carol, for those words of introduction. And thank you to the Fifth Avenue Synagogue for inviting me. And it's a great honor to be here. So, yes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my book and how I came to write it. And I would welcome, questions and comments after I finish. This will take about 45 minutes. So this is the book, Uprooted, which was published in 2018 by Valentine Mitchell, which is a publisher, a British publisher that specializes in Jewish books. And I'm glad to say that sales have been good, and the book has appeared in Norwegian, which you can see here. And then 2 weeks ago, it came out in Portuguese in Brazil, actually, and we had the launch there. It is now being translated into Arabic, and I hugely look forward to that because obviously it's important for this book to reach an Arab speaking or Arab reading, an Arab readership. How did I come to write this book? Well, about 15 years ago, I founded an association, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, called Harif. And Harif's objective was to raise awareness of the history and culture of the Jews from that part of the world, because the diaspora obviously is mostly Ashkenazi, and certainly in Britain, Sephardim and Mizrahim form a very small proportion of the total, and there isn't really much, known about this community. Also, there isn't a huge amount written about them in English, certainly. There's a bit more in French. And around the same time as I started Harif, I also began blogging, and that meant really assembling information about Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And I started blogging every day, you know, surfing the net to see if there was anything interesting. And after about 10 years, I had several thousand posts on this blog, which is called Point of No Return. And you can Google it, Point of No Return blog. So after 10 years, I decided that I had so much material and I'd learned so much that perhaps it was time to put the highlights into a book. And this is what I did. The other reason why I wrote this book is, of course, my family background. As Carol said, my parents were Jewish refugees from Iraq, and they came to the UK in 1950. Now, they were amongst a minority of Jews who didn't go to Israel, because over 90% of the community ended up in Israel. But even though I was born in Britain, the story of the Iraqi Jews really haunted me through my childhood and teenage years. In the 1960s, I had an aunt who decided to go back to Iraq, in fact, and sell some property. Even though she'd actually moved to London with her 3 children, she was in fact a widow. And she went back to Iraq thinking that it would take her a few weeks or maybe a month to sell the property, and then she would be able to rejoin her family in London. As it turned out, she was trapped in Iraq for 6 years, and her children had to be looked after by my parents. And in 1967, as you know, the Six-Day War broke out. This was a terrible defeat for the Arab countries, even though it was a great victory for Israel. And the regime in Iraq began to take its revenge on the few thousand Jews, there were about 3,000 at the time, the few thousand Jews who were still living in Iraq. So they cut off their telephones, they sacked them from their jobs, they wouldn't allow students to go to university, and above all, they wouldn't let them leave the country. In 1969, a terrible event occurred. 14 people were executed in Liberation Square in Baghdad. Of those, 9 were Jews, and they were executed on trumped up spying charges for Israel. And 500,000 Iraqis came to sing and dance under the corpses which were hanging in the square. And this was just the beginning of a terrible period for the Jews of Iraq, because 50 Jews, that's 50, were arrested, jailed, and were never seen again. In fact, we still to this day do not know what happened to them. The remaining Jews were so desperate to leave the country, eventually they were smuggled out. And my aunt and several relatives were amongst them. They had to leave in the dead of night, disguised as Arabs. They were smuggled with the help of the Kurds and with Israel's help as well, through the north of the country, through Kurdistan, and over the border into Iran, which was then, it seems amazing nowadays, friendly to Israel. And that's how they got out. Whoops. Now, the focus of my book is the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. This number is a greater number than Palestinian refugees from what is now Israel, and it was the largest number of non-Muslim refugees from the Middle East up until 2003 and the American invasion of Iraq. And at that point, there was a mass exodus of Christians. They went from about 1.5 million to 250,000 today. The Jews from Arab countries actually were only about 10% of the total Jewish population in 1948. But today they are over 50% of the Jewish population of Israel. And therefore, I believe they are the key to understanding the Middle East conflict, and certainly absolutely key to a peace settlement. Now, just a word about terminology. People talk about Sephardim and they talk about Mizrahim. I use the terms interchangeably. Sephardim, strictly speaking, are those from Spain after the Inquisition. Mizrahim belong to communities, very ancient communities, which really go back thousands of years. But in fact, the two intermingled. Sephardim came to settle in these long-established communities around the Mediterranean basin. And there is very little difference in many of these communities now, although some of the Sephardim still speak Ladino, and there are differences, but basically the communities are now mixed. So just to give you an idea of the sort of what we're talking about in terms of geography, we're talking about communities from Morocco in the far west, right through to Yemen in the east. So 10 Arab countries are the focus of my book. I do touch on Iran a little bit, but I was mainly interested in this mass exodus that occurred in after 1948. And although the Jews of Iran have also dwindled dramatically, from 100,000 Jews, we're now down to about 8,000. This exodus took place 30 years later when the Ayatollahs took over in Iran. So the population actually declined very dramatically. If you compare it with the decline of the Jewish population in Europe, it was actually even more dramatic, although obviously there weren't the same tragic consequences as in Europe, and most Jews did survive this mass exodus. Now, if you look at this chart, this will show you how from 1 million Jews in 1948, we are down to about 4,000 today. And you can see in the first column that communities that had hundreds of thousands of Jews or tens of thousands of Jews, you can now count them on the fingers of 1 or 2 hands. So we have 4 in Iraq, we have perhaps 50 in Yemen. Actually, the latest figures are probably nearer 30. Lebanon, Syria, 20 or even fewer. Egypt, I've heard it said that there are actually fewer than 10. Algeria and Libya have none at all. The other thing you notice about this chart is how very old these communities were. And they do go back actually to the 6th century BCE. In fact, there's a small error because the community in Iraq goes back to 586 BCE. And the others date back to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century before the Christian era. And that is 1,000 years before the advent of Islam and the Arab conquest. In fact, the Middle East has almost as much Jewish history as the land of Israel itself. And 17 biblical prophets are buried there, including 17 biblical figures are buried there, including 5 biblical prophets. And one of those was the prophet Ezekiel. Now, the community of Babylon, the community of Iraq, of the Jews of Iraq, actually call themselves the Babylonian Jewish community. And they were in continuous residence in that part of the world from biblical times. And this is the tomb of Ezekiel, Ezekiel the prophet. The Jews of Iraq, actually the oldest diaspora, and they were taken captive by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered Jerusalem, and he took the Jews as slaves back to Babylon. And many of them did return to Jerusalem. They were allowed to by the Persian king Cyrus, but many of them also chose to stay. And they stayed continuously in that part of the world up until about 50 years ago. So here on the left, you see a photograph of the tomb of Ezekiel in the 1930s. And here are the priests or the scribes who would write benedictions or prayers for the visiting pilgrims. And this was a very popular pilgrimage site for the Jewish community of Iraq. And they would come at the time of Shavuot and also between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And on the right-hand side, you can see a detail from the Hebrew inscriptions that surround the actual burial chamber. But if you look at the picture below, you can see that the shrine is actually unrecognizable today. It has been completely transformed into a mosque. And this has happened in the last 5 years or so. And it is an absolutely massive mosque. And the historic shrine of Ezekiel is actually a tiny part of this huge mosque. And if a Jew were to turn up and want to visit the shrine of Ezekiel, the chances are he wouldn't be allowed in. For a start, Jews are not allowed into mosques, and the Shiites have a prejudice against Jews as being untouchable or unclean. So that's another reason why they wouldn't let a Jew in. And this is basically what's happened to Jewish heritage across the region. It's either been, converted to other purposes, synagogues have turned into mosques or sports clubs or shops or what have you, or the synagogues have been allowed to crumble to dust and decay. Roads have been constructed across cemeteries, and there really is very little left to show for thousands of years of Jewish presence, with one exception, and that is in Morocco, where the Moroccan king has actually spent quite a lot of money on preserving and restoring Jewish sites, synagogues, cemeteries, and even Jewish quarters. But a cynic might say, well, the King of Morocco has good reason to do this because tourism is very important to the Moroccan economy, and tens of thousands of Jewish tourists come to Morocco every year. So what was the relationship between Jews and Muslims when they lived side by side during 14 centuries? Well, there was a great deal of symbiosis. The Jews and Muslims were very close in language, in religion, and of course the environment did influence Jews, and Jews did influence the environment. But symbiosis is not the same as coexistence, which assumes a certain equality in the relationship. In fact, Jews and Christians were inferior. They were considered dhimmis. And a dhimmi had to abide by certain restrictions. He had to wear special clothing. He didn't have the same legal rights as a Muslim. And above all, he had to pay a tax. And this was really a bit like a protection racket. In other words, the Jew had to pay a tax to the ruler to protect him. And you may ask yourself, well, protect from whom? And the truth is that there were riots, there were troubles, and the Jew did depend on the rule of the day to defend him. The dhimmi rules were not always uniformly applied. Sometimes they were disregarded altogether. But the Jew had to be continually reminded that, that he hadn't converted to the ultimate revelation of Islam, and he was held in contempt for that reason. So I will read you a little passage from my book to illustrate the dhimmi status. In a similar way to their Ashkenazi counterparts in medieval Europe, Jews in Morocco were debarred from certain occupations by the Islamic guilds. As in Europe, they performed certain necessary economic functions like money lending and associated tasks like metalworking, which were deemed reprehensible or unlucky by the non-Jewish majority. The Jews were given the most menial of tasks. One such job assigned to them was the salting of the decapitated heads of executed captives. In Yemen, the job of cleaning the sewers was done by a subcaste of Jews. In Egypt today, the Christian Copts are the rubbish collectors. In 20th century Iraq, Christians also did menial jobs in conformity with their lowly status, like cleaning septic tanks. The small Sephardi community of Palestine was so abased under Muslim rule that a contingent of Ashkenazi followers of the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi, seeking refuge in Jerusalem in 1700, refused to put up with the humiliations suffered by the Sephardim. The Arabs behave as proper thugs towards the Jews, one wrote. In Palestine, Jews were not allowed to worship freely at their holy places. The Mamluk rulers forbade them from treading beyond the 7th step on the staircase to the burial place of the patriarchs in Hebron. Nothing equals the misery and suffering of the Jews of Jerusalem, wrote Karl Marx. Turks, Arabs, and Moors are the masters in every respect. To be a dhimmi was to be continually reminded of Islam's supremacy over Judaism and Christianity. Of course, Jews performed an essential function as commercial go-betweens and could and did rise to lofty positions as courtiers, sarafs, that's treasurers, and merchants. Some were fabulously rich, like Haim Fahi. But like him, these Jews could just as quickly fall into disfavor. Fahy had his nose cut off and his eye gouged out by a treacherous Ottoman governor and was subsequently assassinated. So you can see that the situation of the Jews varied from ruler to ruler. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was terrible. But you could always be sure that the condition of the Jew was always precarious, and you never knew what the future would bring. So all this changed quite dramatically in the 19th century as the Western powers increased their influence in the Middle East and North Africa, and they began to insist on the abrogation of the Dhimmi rules. So in 1856, Jews were given equal rights to Muslims. Jews and Christians were given equal rights to Muslims, and the Dhimmi rules were abrogated. This was in the Ottoman Empire, but in parts of the Muslim world that were not controlled by the Ottomans, the Dhimmi rules actually endured up until the 20th century. So it was still in existence, the Dhimmi status was still in existence up until 1925 in Persia, present-day Iran. It was still in existence in Morocco in 1912 and the start of the French protectorate. But in the Ottoman Empire, the Jews were granted theoretical equality. Around the same time as the Western powers began to increase their influence, a group of well-meaning French Jews set up a network of schools called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to equip these benighted Jewish communities in the Muslim world with the skills to prosper in the modern era. And these Jews were such a success, actually, that a Jewish middle class began to emerge. Girls became educated for the very first time, and Jews were exposed to a secular education. So they learned languages, they learned maths, they learned science. And when the colonial powers established their mandates and their protectorates, the Jews were in a very good position to become the backbone of the colonial administration. And so you found that they dominated the civil service, transport, the postal service, and then they became prominent in trade and finance and banking. And they even entered politics for the first time. So in the 1920s, you had a Jewish finance minister in Iraq and also one in Egypt. They also excelled in the arts. So I'm talking about this very short period, really, from the end of the 19th century up until the 1940s. All the musicians in Iraq were practically Jewish. Out of 250 instrumentalists in the Baghdad Radio Orchestra, only 3 were Muslim, the rest were Jewish. And this wasn't because Jews were any better at playing music, but it was because an imam had declared a ban on Muslims learning or playing music. And the story is told that the Iraqi prime minister turned on the radio in the 1940s, and it happened to be Yom Kippur that day. And of course, the Jews didn't play. And he was so frustrated at the fact that he couldn't hear music that he determined to found an orchestra that didn't have Jews in it. On the top right, you see Liliane Levy-Cohen, whose stage name was Camellia, and she's on the front cover of my book here. She was a young Egyptian Jewish actress. She starred in about 18 films in the 1940s. Sadly, she died in a plane crash. People said she was the mistress of the Egyptian king, King Farouk, and conspiracy theories had it that he had her killed because she was not, he didn't want her around for some reason. But that's probably just a legend. Bottom left-hand corner, you see Leila Murad, who was the great diva of the Egyptian film industry, a great singer, and her songs are played today. And she's still very popular in Egypt and around the Arab world, although people don't know that she was Jewish. Salim Halali, a great musician from Algeria. But this golden era, I would say, was very short-lived. And it came to an end really with the rise of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism took several forms. One was colonial anti-Semitism. On the right-hand side, you see the front cover of a book by Edouard Rumont. Edouard Rumont was the MP or the representative for the parliamentary representative for Algiers. Now, Algeria was considered part of metropolitan France. And in fact, the Jews in Algeria were granted French citizenship in 1870. The Muslims were not. But there was a population of white settlers called Pieds Noirs in Algeria, and they were extremely anti-Semitic. And Edouard Rumont was their leader. He even led the campaign against Captain Dreyfus, who, as you know, was the Jewish captain who was accused of betraying France. The anti-Semitic settler population in Algeria even incited riots against the Jews of Algeria in the late 19th century. And the colonial powers, although they were very happy to exploit the Jews for their talents and their skills and their languages, were not always ready to defend them in times of trouble. So you get instances of riots breaking out against the Jews, and the forces of law and order take hours to turn up. And of course, the ultimate betrayal was during World War II, when the Vichy pro-Nazi governments were established in North Africa, and they began really to pass the first discriminatory laws leading to the final solution. They stripped the Jews of their rights, their citizenship, and they began to take the first steps towards rounding them up. But thankfully, the Vichy regimes were deposed and defeated by the Allies, who defeated the Germans at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. There's another example of the colonial power really refusing to defend the Jews, and that was in Iraq in 1941. A terrible massacre called the Farhud erupted on the 1st and 2nd of June in 1941. The British Army stood at the gates of Baghdad. They could have quelled the riot and spared many Jewish lives, but they didn't, because they didn't want to appear to be occupying the country and interfering in its internal affairs. There was another form of anti-Semitism that arose at this time, and that was the anti-Semitism associated with Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalist parties began to emerge in the 1930s. Many of them were influenced by Nazism. And they were blood and soil nationalist parties that wanted independence for Arab countries, but at the same time, they wanted to exclude anyone who was not Arab and eventually anyone who was not Muslim. And here you see the symbol of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which actually still exists today in Syria and Lebanon. There was another form of anti-Semitism that arose in the 1930s, and that was the anti-Semitism of Islamism. Now, Islamism, we hear a lot about today. We hear about ISIL or ISIS, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, that sort of thing. But actually the granddaddy of them all was the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in 1928. And the founder was an Egyptian called Hassan al-Banna, gentleman in the fez. Now, anti-Semitism was at the very heart of the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy, because what they wanted to do was re-establish the caliphate that had come to an end with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And the Muslim Brotherhood hated the Jews, not just because of the rising tensions in Palestine between Jews and Arabs, but because they considered that the Jews really epitomized everything they hated most. The Jews represented modernity, they represented women's rights, they represented civil rights and minority rights. And the Muslim Brotherhood began to incite violence against the Jews in Egypt in the 1930s and also against the Christian Copts. There was a three-way alliance that soon developed between the Islamists and the Germans. At first, there was the slight problem that the Arabs were not considered Aryans, but towards the end of the 1930s, the Germans decided that maybe it was a good idea to enter into an alliance with the Arabs and encourage them to start an uprising against the British and the French. And so the Germans actually financed the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood. And here you see a picture of the German ambassador to Baghdad, Fritz Grobber. He was in place for most of the 1930s. Mein Kampf was translated into Arabic and serialized in Arabic newspapers. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were also translated and circulated. And the third party in this three-way alliance was Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Now, the Grand Mufti was an anti-Semite before he was an anti-Zionist. And wherever he went in the Arab world, he incited anti-Jewish hatred. And he entered an alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood because their ideologies were very similar. And what they did was they combined sort of traditional prejudice against the Jews, as could be found in the Quranic, anti-Jewish Quranic verses, with a sort of new kind of ideology that penetrated the Arab world from Europe. And this ideology really held that Jews were the fount of all evil and that they were conspiring to dominate the world and should be fought at all costs. And this was something new because basically Islam held Jews and Christians in contempt for not having converted to the ultimate religion. But in fact, it didn't hate Jews as Jews. This is very much a European idea. Now, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem ended up in Iraq in 1939. He spent 2 years there in exile, and he never ceased to try and overthrow the pro-British government there. Eventually, a pro-Nazi coup occurred in April of 1941, and the Grand Mufti and pro-Nazi officers set up a pro-Nazi government. They declared war against the British. Their government was short-lived, but the Mufti managed to incite enough hatred amongst the local Arabs in Baghdad and elsewhere in Iraq that it led to the Farhud massacre I mentioned earlier of June the 1st and 2nd of 1941. Although the Mufti and the other leaders of the pro-Nazi government were put to flight by the British, the damage had been done, and 179 Jews were killed in the Farhud of Iraq. We don't know the exact figures. There could have been up to 600 dead, and we probably will never know the final tally. Now, the Mufti ended up in Berlin, where he had his famous meeting with Hitler in November 1941. And the purpose of this meeting was really to ask Hitler's permission for the Mufti to manage the extermination of the Jews, not just in Palestine, but throughout the Arab world. So he wasn't just content to overthrow the British and French colonial powers. He was going to go to the bitter end and kill every single Jew when the Nazis emerged victorious, as he was sure they would, at the end of the war. But thankfully, Rommel was defeated at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, and the Jews were saved. The Mufti also created Muslim SS divisions in Bosnia and Albania, and here you see the Muslim soldiers at prayer. And there is a myth that the Holocaust didn't affect Jews in Arab countries. This is not true. As you can see, the Jews in Tunisia actually came under direct Nazi control for 6 months, starting in November 1942. And here you see the Jews with their picks and shovels being marched off to labor camps. The picture below shows you Libyan Jews returning from Bergen-Belsen. Actually, hundreds of Libyan Jews of British nationality were deported to the continent of Europe and ended up in Bergen-Belsen, although most of them did survive. There was a terrible camp in Libya itself called Jado. About 2,000 Jews were imprisoned in that camp, and of them 600 died of starvation or typhus. Not very well known is the existence of some 30 camps in Morocco, and these camps had dreadful conditions there. Dozens of the inmates died. There was one punishment camp there in the north called Bergent, which was full of Jews. It was almost exclusively Jewish. And these inmates were meant to be building the Trans-Sahara Railway. Now, I read an article only this week that there were prisoners who were meant to be sent from mainland Europe, from France, to these camps in Morocco, and so notorious was their reputation that the prisoners refused to go, and 150 of them were actually shot in France for refusing to go to these camps. So the big question is, what came first, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? There is a myth that anti-Semitism in the Arab world only began when Israel was established in 1948. But as you can see from this postcard, which shows the aftermath of a massacre of Jews in 1912 in Fez in Morocco, anti-Semitism did exist in the Arab world. And actually Morocco has one of the worst records for riots and pogroms. And if you look at the plight of other minorities in Arab countries, for instance, the Yazidis, the Copts, the Assyrian Christians, all these minorities have suffered persecution, and yet they had no Israel of their own. So this points to perhaps a dysfunction in Arab or Muslim society in which difference is not really tolerated. So fast forward to 1948, the state of Israel is declared. 7 Arab League countries declare war on it. And at the same time, they declare war on their own Jewish citizens, who are then branded as the Jewish minority of Palestine. And these Arab countries pass discriminatory laws that strip the Jews of their rights, freeze their bank accounts, sort of expel them from public service jobs, withdraw export and import licenses from them, etc. There was also a great deal of violence that broke out in Arab countries. Even as early as 1945, hundreds of Jews died in Libya in a pogrom there. There was more violence in 1948, and hundreds more Jews died. And eventually pressure built up to such an extent that Jews were desperate to leave. Perhaps the worst sort of anti-Jewish measure was really the criminalization of Zionism, which meant that you could be arrested, you could be jailed, and you could even be executed on charges of being a Zionist. The real question was, how do you define Zionism? Was it if you had a wristwatch, could that be Zionism? Because you could be sending secret signals to the Zionists with your watch. If you were caught smoking a cigarette, that could be incriminating because you could be sending smoke signals to the Zionists. All this did happen. So pressure did build up to such an extent that Israel reached a deal with certain Arab governments to rescue the Jews, the Jewish populations, and take them to Israel. And this is what happened with the Jews of Yemen in 1949. Here you see them. They boarded a plane, even though they'd never seen a plane before. They boarded without fear because the parasha, the previous Shabbat, had actually said, quoting God's words, "I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." And these were very religious Jews, and they thought God had actually sent the plane to save them. This is an Iraqi document, an Iraqi laissez-passer, which was issued to Iraqi Jews in 1950 when emigration was allowed for just 1 year. But the price that Jews had to pay was to be stripped of their Iraqi citizenship and eventually of their property. Now, Lawrence and I found this laissez-passer in a flea market in Tel Aviv. The stamp on the left-hand side reads in Arabic, "One way, no return." So effectively, these Jews were being expelled. They couldn't go back to the country. And this also occurred in 1956 to Egyptian Jews whose expulsion was even more dramatic, and some of them were given only 24 hours to leave the country. Now, these Jews left with one suitcase and £20 in their pockets. And there was a class of very wealthy Jews living in Egypt. And here you see a picture of the Swiss embassy in Cairo, which is formerly the residence of the Zuckerman family. And it is astonishing how many embassies in Cairo today were once the homes of Jewish families. For instance, the Russian embassy used to belong to a Jew called Joseph Nissim. The Pakistani embassy, the South Korean embassy, the German embassy, the Canadian embassy, the Dutch embassy were all former Jewish homes. I tell a little story in my book. The house of the Castro family was actually taken over by the Sadats. Anwar Sadat was, of course, the president of Egypt, and his wife Jahan Sadat lived in the house after her husband was assassinated. And one day she was giving a lecture in New York, in fact, and Mrs. Castro was in the audience. And after Jahan Sadat had finished her lecture, Jahan Sadat went up to her, congratulated her. "That was a wonderful lecture. Did you know that I'm from Egypt too?" And Jahan Sadat said, "Oh, that's fantastic. You really must come back to Egypt and show your children." And she said, "Beti betak," which is Arabic for "my house is your house." And it literally was. And this is a press cutting from a Hebrew newspaper showing all the Jewish-owned property around Tahrir Square in the center of Cairo. So what happened to these Jews? Where did they go? Well, the answer is 650,000 out of 850,000 went to Israel. Now, Israel only had 600,000 people living in it. And so it doubled its population virtually overnight. But it was then a very poor developing country, and it didn't have the accommodation, it didn't have the jobs, and it didn't have the food for all these people. So Israel had to set up tent camps, or ma'barot. And these tent camps endured for a decade or more. They were canvas tents at first, but these turned into tin huts or wooden huts. And slowly these ma'barot turned into towns and cities. And so, for instance, the town of Sderot, which we hear a lot about in the south of the country, started life as a tent camp. And this is an invitation that was sent out on the occasion of a wedding. This is actually an Iraqi couple. And the invitation says, "Please come to our wedding on such a date in hut number 10. Now, the question is, why has this story been neglected? Why haven't we heard about it? And this artwork by an artist called Mir Gal shows you how few pages in an Israeli school textbook were devoted to the history and heritage of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. All this is changing slowly. The Israeli government has woken up to the need to really raise awareness of this story. In 2010, the Knesset passed a law saying that a peace agreement must not be signed unless compensation for Jewish refugees is on the table. And in 2014, another law was passed designating a date in the calendar, the 30th of November, as the day to commemorate the exodus of Jewish refugees from Arab countries and Iran. And this is something which is being increasingly marked by synagogues, communities, schools around the world. And certainly my organization, Harif, does something every year. And we urge your synagogue and your community to do the same. This is not just a niche Sephardi or Mizrahi story. This is part of the story of the Jewish people, just as the Holocaust is part of the story of the Jewish people. So I would just leave you with this thought before I finish, and that is the Jews are an indigenous people of the Middle East. And in fact, what we are accustomed to referring as the Arab world is not really the Arab world. It's a rich patchwork of different tribes and groups and religions and sects. And several of these have been around well before the conquest of the Arab conquest and Islam. Take the Kurds, for instance, and they've been clamoring for self-determination for over 100 years, but they haven't managed it. Only the Jews are the only indigenous non-Muslim people to have succeeded in acquiring self-determination. And they are not an anomaly in the region. They're absolutely organic there. And they shouldn't be seen as, you know, settler colonialists or anything like that. So I would just say that the lesson that minorities have learned from living in the Middle East is really that in order to survive in such an inhospitable environment, you do need your own sovereign state and the power to defend it. And so we are extremely lucky to have Israel. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lyn. That was just wonderful. There are some questions, and then I'll invite the audience, if they have additional questions, to submit them through either the chat or the Q&A function on the screen, and I'm happy to share those as well. So let me ask you, taking off your historian hat for a minute, no one would have anticipated today that a community of 250,000 Jews would exist in Germany. I know that historians typically look backwards and not forward, but do you have any thoughts as to whether Jewish communities might be reestablished in the Arab world, particularly given the recent historic agreements between the US and Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, and I believe Sudan?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very interesting question. Yes, thank you for that. It is amazing that there are now 250,000 Jews living in Germany, given its very tragic history. But there's been a very important development in Germany, and that is it has recognized the suffering of the Jews in the Holocaust. it has tried to give reparations to Jews, and it has, you know, started on a new footing, if you like, with a blank page. This has not happened with Arab countries. The Arab countries have not even recognized that they have kicked out their refugees, that their Jews have been refugees. They are still denying that this exodus has happened, let alone, you know, compensating them. So, I mean, we are a long, long way from, I think, being in the same position as Germany. What has happened with the Abraham Accords is very exciting, and it is very encouraging. And the UAE in particular, I think, is really quite interesting what's happened there. There are only a few hundred Jews, and this is a new community of expatriates, basically, business expatriates from Europe and America. But they're being allowed to practice Judaism, and there are relations now with Israel, and they even have 3 rabbis looking after them. And I think the UAE is quite keen to show that it is pluralistic and tolerant. But you have to remember that the Emirati component of the UAE is actually only 12%. This is not a democracy. All the work is done by guest workers. It's an authoritarian society, if you like. Things can change at a moment's notice. And we saw what happened in Egypt, which signed a peace treaty in 1979 with Israel. You know, great fanfare at the time. Israelis flooded into the country to visit the sites, and then the president, you know, switched off the tap, and it became a cold peace. And anti-Semitism has never been higher than, you know, greater than in Egypt today. So, you know, these regimes are not reliable. They're not democratic, and they can change at a moment's notice. And this is my fear, you know.
Mm-hmm. And unsteady. One of our audience members has asked if the Palestinians are considered an indigenous people in the Maghreb.
This is complicated because some Palestinians have been there for generations and for centuries, but the whole Palestinian nationalist movement really began in the 20th century. And it began as a pan-Arab movement, really in opposition to Zionism. So I would say it's not any more indigenous than any other Arab nationalist movement. And you may even say that if Zionism didn't exist, the Palestinian nationalist movement might not have existed either. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's a difficult one.
Yeah, thank you. I think you mentioned one country where a Jew was a finance minister, and I was wondering if there were other countries where Jews had high-level roles in government, either by appointment or otherwise. And then as a follow-up, I was curious if you could talk a little bit about what the impact was on some of these countries when the Jews left, especially if they had been involved at a high level politically or professionally.
Yes, there was a finance minister in Iraq called Heskel Sassoon in the 1920s. And in fact, he's held in such regard that there's a picture in my book showing a demonstration, I think it was in 2003, in Iraq, actually protesting against the sort of current caliber of ministers in Iraq, and kind of harking back with nostalgia to the days of Heskel Sassoon. There was also a finance minister in Egypt called Katawi Pasha. And there were ministers in Tunisia for a short time, and even in Morocco. But basically, the Jews were really not part of public life, the public sphere in these countries. They were traditionally dhimmis, which meant that they had no political role. And so their contribution to politics was really very short-lived. And although they had parliamentary representatives, they were really representatives of a minority. They weren't really, for instance, a Jew couldn't be elected to represent a majority Muslim district, for instance. You know, they were like token representatives, if you like. They represented their own community. Mm-hmm. So we never really got beyond that in the 20th century. And then everything turned sour, and you know, the exodus happened. To answer your other question about what society's lost, well, of course, the Jews made a huge contribution economically and of course culturally to these communities. Economically, for instance, in Iraq, there's a picture of the Iraqi what do they call the Board of Commerce, I think, in Baghdad, and of 20 people in the picture, like 10 were Jews or something. So they really made a huge contribution to the economy, and they were the interface with Europe. They were the ones who traded and brought in, you know, all the new things from Europe. You know, they were also the entrepreneurs. For instance, they started the railways in Egypt. They started the sugar business in Egypt. The stock exchange is dominated by Jews, and the banks were all founded by Jews, both in Egypt and in Iraq, for instance.
For example.
But that's in the Ottoman, yeah. So, of course, they left a gaping hole when they left. And I don't think the Arab countries have really managed to fill that hole. In fact, there's quite a lot of nostalgia, especially in Iraq after the Arab Spring in 2011. You started getting this sort of nostalgia for the Jewish communities, and Jewish music began to be rediscovered. You know, they discovered that some of the music they'd been listening to was actually was composed by Jews, and all this had been suppressed up until that time. And it's amazing the interaction now. For instance, the Israeli sort of Facebook page in Arabic has a huge number of, you know, Arabic readers, and there's a lot of interaction there. But I think what they want to do is they want the Jews to return. You know, they want to turn the clock back. They're not ready to come to terms with the fact that the Jews are not going to return, you know, and their children are not going to return. So, you know, they still haven't quite, you know, got to that stage of recognizing that most of these Jews are now in Israel. Mm-hmm. They're not coming back.
Maybe we'll do one final question, if that's okay. You know, I think there's probably a temptation from the Western perspective to clump many of these populations together as so-called Arab Jews, but as you stated, there's a lot of diversity. Surely the communities are not monolithic. And I was wondering if you could perhaps point out a difference or a couple differences between some of the different communities among the 10 countries that are highlighted in your book.
Yeah, well, I would object to the expression Arab Jew, because that doesn't actually exist, except on the far left, they like to refer to Arab Jews, but in fact, no Jew I know would actually accept to be called an Arab Jew. There are Jews who say they are Egyptian Jews or Iraqi Jews or Lebanese Jews, but the Jews were always separate communities in these countries. There was never any intermarriage with Muslims or Christians. They had a separate identity, and they even had a separate language, a sort of Judeo-Arabic dialect, which had Hebrew words, for instance, and is sometimes not even understood by the majority Muslim population. So they had their own identity. They had their own musical traditions, obviously their own religious tradition. What more can I say, really? I mean, the Jews, I think, had more in common than they had, they had more in common with Ashkenazi Jews in many ways than they have differences. You can't lump them all together. Also, you can't lump people who lived in rural communities with people who lived in cities. Like, for instance, those who were not educated or not even literate had nothing in common with, say, people who went to the Alliance Israelite schools and who could speak several languages and were very highly educated. So there was a great difference there. So I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, I just want to thank you for illuminating the role that we will not call them Arab Jews, but the Jews living in the Arab world have had in the history of the Jewish people. And now, of course, today, their fundamental role in modern day Israel. We really don't have to look any farther than the recent Torah portions to see how high, what levels the Jews achieved as Yosef was in Pharaoh's palace in that world. Within the history you've shared, we see how the past has informed the present. And unfortunately, we see the anti-Semitism that accompanied the Jews on their journey through history, making their survival, not only their survival, but of course, their incredible success even more remarkable. So we pray in our community that the descendants of the Arab Jews continue to thrive and flourish no matter where they are living.
Yeah.
I want to offer a huge thank you to Carol and Michael Goddard again for their role in bringing today's program to pass, and of course to Mrs. Julius for an outstanding lecture and presentation. Thank you so very much.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, Rachel, and it's been a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Oops.